Our journey through monasticism, which briefly takes us from the desert of Egypt through Benedict of Nursia, travels north through Gaul to Ireland. It's hard not to tell the story of Irish Christianity without the famous figure of Patrick, here represented in a modern form and in the background with one of the Celtic round towers at Aishigur. Patrick was without doubt one of the most significant figures in the conversion of Ireland to Christianity. Enormous was his personal commitment to the task, for which he would suffer terribly. Some had preceded him, but many would follow. Patricius, or Patrick, was born in the 4th century, or perhaps the first part of the 5th century, in Roman Britain, those lands marked off by Hadrian's Wall. Shortly before he was 16, something terrible befell the young man. His family estate was raided, and he and others were taken away in captivity, in slavery to Ireland. Eventually, he would escape and spend time in Gaul. But ultimately, he would return as a missionary, having had a dream that summoned him back to Ireland. The initiative for his return to Ireland was with this powerful dream in which he heard the voice of the Irish. Patrick was a brave man and a determined one. His readiness to carry on evangelizing led to many converts in Ireland. He talks himself in his confession about the baptizing of so many thousands and of ordaining clergy. He did this all over the place in his own words. There were 2 types of converts which are particularly mentioned: the sons and daughters of petty kings who embraced the monastic life, and women who adopted the life of virginity against their family's will. And in particular, amongst these women were those who were slaves, who opted for this life despite much harassment. Therefore, we see that Patrick made converts at all levels of Irish society. Although Patrick was determined to establish a Roman-style episcopacy, following his work, the Irish Church became largely in character monastic. Monasticism came to Ireland from Britain and Gaul. Men and women, married and celibate, were admitted into houses. These communities were kenobitic, that was, brought together in community, not as individual figures. Although people lived in separate cells or huts, they ate their meals together. There were some who adopted the ascetic life and became hermits. The first monastery in Ireland was likely St. Enda, around 450, on the Aran Islands. These monasteries were built first of wood, and of those nothing survives, but later they became stone structures that have endured. And perhaps amongst the most famous are the beehive structures found across the southwest. These ones here on Skellig Michael, where monks would live, pray, and carry out acts of asceticism. The oldest surviving chapel dates from the 6th century. These buildings here on Skellig Michael are to be found, like many of the monastic buildings, on islands off the coast. Here, 8 miles from Kerry. Alongside the beehive structures, we find both sculptures and a graveyard. Another major figure in this development of monasticism was St. Finian of Clonard, who died in 549. He was one of the earliest monastic saints and founded Clonard Abbey. Not only was he a founder, but he was an inspirer of a group known as the 12 Apostles, who would go on to found a whole range of monastic houses. Amongst these persons was Columba. But the houses were not just for men. Bridget at Kildare, a famous figure, founded a monastery that was a double monastery for both men and women. These monastic houses might have upward of 1,000 people. Their structures were simple, yet they reflected the village communities in which they were founded. Surrounded by a wall, the monks lived and prayed in huts, as I say, first made of wood, then later of stone. They would gather together in churches to pray, bound together by the liturgy, and they would eat in refectories. These communities were presided over by abbots and abbesses, yet the life was simple and self-denying, a diet of beer, fish, honey, and milk. The monks wore a tunic, sandals, and manual labor, as we saw in the Benedictine tradition, was central to their life. Reflecting its origins in Gaul, Irish monasticism used Latin for its liturgy, its worship. And distinctive of the Irish tradition was a love of liturgy, as well as the role of the Bible. Perhaps, well, not perhaps, most strikingly represented in the Book of Kells, which appeared around 800, produced on the island of Iona. The Book of Kells testifies to the great talent of Irish calligraphy and design. Here we have Mary with the child from the Gospel of Mark, is surrounded by angels and figures in beautiful, stunning colors and ornaments that reflect a degree of sophistication and artistic vision. It is one of the first representations of Mary and the child in Western manuscripts. But not just the Bible. The Irish Church developed a series of devotional works and beautiful sacred objects. The scribes studied the liberal arts as well as the church fathers. They recorded even the pre-Christian myths of the Celtic tradition. Irish monasticism famously was known for its extreme asceticism, such as the reciting of the Psalter while standing in the sea, very cold. These included also fasting, silence, sleep deprivation, long periods of prayer, and mortification of the body. Penitentials, works of penance, were developed which assigned the penances to both monks and lay people. There was also a strong emphasis on pastoral care and spiritual development, and in this respect, preaching was important. And I think one of the ways in which this spirituality is best reflected is in the term anamkara, a soul friend, a confessor, an advisor, a spiritual companion, a degree of coming together with another in the service of Christ. With the Benedictines and others that we have seen, hospitality, care of travelers and refugees were hallmarks of Irish monasticism. But alongside the kenobitic, the communal living, was a tradition of the ascetic, those who separated themselves from community. And in this way, there was a veneration of the Desert Fathers, that the nature was seen as a place of retreat. This ascetic devotion also led to travel. Travel was an important part of the life of the Irish monks. It was a pilgrimage, a setting out. And it took monks across the sea to Scotland, to the pagan people of Northern Europe. By the 9th century, however, these missionaries were also joined by wandering scholars. However, there was a terrible development. By 795, the Vikings were raiding the coasts of Ireland and traveling up rivers that they could navigate. They sacked monasteries and killed large numbers of people. In many ways, it brought to an end the golden age of Irish monasticism. Although it had distinctive traditions, the Irish Church regarded itself as loyal to Rome. But Ireland had never been conquered by the Romans. It had not been a province. It had a distinctive history and culture. That culture was preserved in the monasteries. And at the heart of that culture and that missionary work was the island of Iona, where Columba came in 563 and founded a monastery that would be at the center of a network of religious houses that spread across Ireland and then into Scotland. Columba launched his missions to the Pictish tribes in Scotland. This would ultimately have great influence on the development of Christian Northumbria in the northeast of England. Aidan, in 634, a monk from Iona, became bishop of Northumbria, and his base was Lindisfarne. The influence of Iona stretched across Scotland into northern England. But this Irish Christianity that was spreading and whose influence was so pervasive ultimately encountered the Roman Christianity in England. And at the Synod of Whitby in 664, it was decided that the Roman calculation of Easter, as well as other Roman practices, were to be preferred to the Celtic custom. Many monks returned to Iona, but as the influence of Lindisfarne and Northumbrian Roman tradition grew, Iona, however, would remain a place of pilgrimage until it was ultimately destroyed by the Vikings. The influence of the Celtic Irish tradition in Christianity is enormous. It revived the church. It created vibrant traditions that were ultimately, through Christian Northumbria, brought back to the continent. And it's not the case that at Whitby simply the Celts were defeated by the Roman tradition. There was a great deal of overlap, of cultural sharing. And this we will see in the figure of Bede, who in his life of St. Cuthbert tells the story of a Celtic saint whose influence on the Roman Church was to be admired. The energy and vitality of the Irish tradition passed into the further development of the Church and ultimately its revival on the continent.